First of all, apologies that I can't be there in person, but it's an honor to be invited to this event, and I hope that this project LUNARK that I'll be talking about by Saga Space Architects will be really interesting to all of you who are here today. And once again, thank you for inviting me. In essence, Project LUNARK is the design and construction of a prototype moon habitat, which we are actually currently testing right now in northern Greenland, in Arctic Greenland. And of course, I think someone has read a bio about me, but all you need to know is that I'm a psychologist and I'm the space psychologist lead at Saga Space Architects, and I'm also an alumni and staff at the International Space University. So LUNARK, this idea for a lunar habitat prototype, I think it was born in 2019, before I joined even Saga Space Architects, and these two lovely gents that you see on the left there, Sebastian and Carl, they sat down together in 2019 and they asked themselves that question that you see at the top there: what does it take to live on the moon? And obviously right now we have no way of landing on the moon, at least with people. As you know, there's the Artemis mission, and if they're struggling to do it right now at NASA, there's no way we can do it with the small amount of funding that we have. So the next best thing that we can do is test a lunar prototype of a habitat here on Earth in somewhere where that's analogous to what it would be like on the moon. So they decided on Arctic Greenland because of a few certain conditions. The temperature, for one, extreme cold, extreme monotony and isolation, and as well as, well, you won't have hurricane winds on the moon, but that does mean that you have to have a sturdy habitat, which is the same as you would have on the moon. You want your habitat to be sturdy and strong enough to deal with the rigors of spaceflight. The motto they devised when they were coming up with this project was, when we go to the moon, we must thrive, not just survive. And I was particularly happy when I looked at the Symposium program and I saw the exact same thing. So it's truly fantastic to see that this motto isn't just something that we've been looking at, but it's something that's represented by the rest of the field as well. And again, just to reiterate what we're doing, it is to design a moon habitat from scratch and test it in the first Arctic simulated moon mission, and then of course share the results with the world. So over the past couple of months, we have, well, the team in Denmark have designed and built it in Copenhagen. In 2019, they sat down and came up with the first few concepts, and then they started building a prototype habitat in, I think it was beginning of this year, and then they built the final habitat itself back in August. And then right now, the team are actually conducting the mission in northern Greenland, in Arctic Greenland. I think they reached Greenland in the end of August, and they started the mission at the beginning of this month being September. And when they come back, I think the mission ends in late November. They come back in December, the beginning of December, I think. They'll have a bit of time off, and then they'll share whatever they found and their experiences. We also have a few experiments that I'll talk about later. And you can ignore the wall of text there, but the reason they want to do this mission is because they really want to understand from an architectural point of view, but also as a human point of view, what it's like to be in extreme isolation by yourself for a prolonged period of time. I think this is something that really resonates with me, especially when you're not, let's say, an astronaut or someone who has a career working in these fields. You might have this kind of, not everyone, but you might have this kind of backseat approach and not truly understand the kind of rigors that are being dealt with on the field. And in turn, when I was talking to Carl and Sebastian, the leads of this project, they really wanted to get stuck into the gritty details and experience what it was like for themselves. So in future, when they design habitats, they have that knowledge and they know the kind of issues that are being faced when you are working in such conditions, and thus design a better habitat for them. So this is a presentation that I've taken from them actually, and they put this quote in, which I do quite like. And it's, if you want to instigate the art of manslaughter, just shut two men up in an 18 by 20 foot cabin for a month. Human nature won't stand it. Well, there's an element of truth to that all issues in space and enclosed spaces in particular tend to be exacerbated, but we know from experience since the 60s that it is doable, and we'll get on that later in terms of countermeasures and how we deal with stressful situations and environments in these kind of places. But that kind of element of the danger and conflict is part of the reason why they did choose to go to the Arctic for 3 months. One of the criticisms that, when I talked to Sebastian in particular, he said current analog missions, not all of them, but some of them, they often, due to ethical constraints, and that's perfectly understandable, they often miss out this element of danger, like real danger. And obviously they are limited by that because they have ethical responsibilities and liabilities. In the case of LUNARK, because the two main leads, they're leading the project, they came up with a habitat, and they themselves self-selected to do this project and go to Arctic Greenland to live there for 3 months. Those kind of ethical responsibilities can be lowered a little bit because they're the ones that are taking the risks themselves. It's not someone else buying in externally and then that leads to a whole other bunch of complications. It's them that are they themselves doing it. And in turn, by placing themselves in such a dangerous situation, they want to replicate the real rigors of space, because space is a very dangerous place. It's very hostile. Admittedly, the Arctic isn't as quite as hostile, but it's the next best thing that we have on Earth. It's one of the best analogs that we have to human spaceflight. And so, as such, they want to see what it's truly like to live not only isolated and confined, but have that element of danger involved as well. Again, I've already kind of touched on this about why northern Greenland. You have the extreme temperatures and the remoteness and isolation. I believe the closest humans nearby to them are 45 kilometers away in a military base of all things. And you can see the X marks the spot, just how far north they are. But one of the reasons that they've chosen this is because for a certain part of their mission, they will have permanent sunlight. I think it's for at least a month, if not more. They will have permanent sunlight. The sun will never set. And especially given that some of the moon locations for future settlements or missions are on these, what we call the peaks of eternal light, where you have prolonged sunlight for a long amount of time. This is a really good analog to see how the human body adapts to this kind of environment where you have prolonged sunlight, how it affects our circadian rhythms, for instance. So this is one reason why they were really excited to test out the habitat as well as themselves in northern Greenland. So in terms of roadmap, I briefly touched on this, but as I mentioned, back in 2019, that's when they first started the planning in terms of logistics and shipping, as well as the first concepts of the habitat, the main focal points they wanted to address and include in the habitat, and then also have an open call for research. The beginning of this year, which is when I joined, we started looking at the research proposals together to decide which ones we wanted. And the first prototype of this habitat, and I realized I called it a lunar prototype habitat earlier. Well, this is a prototype of the prototype made out of wood, just to test out the construction and see if all the elements work together. That was built until June and it was fantastic. It worked fantastic. And then in July, the construction of the final habitat itself began, and that was a arduous task. I think I wasn't there because I'm in the UK, but I was in contact with the team in Denmark, and they were working in shifts throughout the night, working full rotors for weeks on end, and they got it done in the nick of time, thankfully. And they also did some pre-flight tests in Denmark, which I'll get onto later, in some of the certain systems involved in the habitat. And then the mission started in September and it's currently underway. We get daily updates from them because we have a satellite link with them, but communication is extremely limited. That's of their design. They completely wanted to be shut off and they are barely getting any information back in. I think they've got a few questions from some of the supporters because we had a Kickstarter, but very little communication, if any, between the outside world and them. I think they have a daily checkup with the local military base to make sure that they're okay, but that's about it. And of course, during the mission, they'll have a bunch of experiments and studies that they are undergoing, and I'll touch a bit on these later. And when they do come back in late November, beginning of December, we of course will do a data analysis for all the experiments and studies, and then there will be educational talks. Sebastian and Carl have been doing this for quite a while now, in going out to schools, universities across the world, and just sharing the experience of space architecture. And in addition to that, we have a documentary coming out, which I don't think I can say too much about, but it's exciting. It's very exciting. So in regards to the habitat itself, I'll go through this list quickly, but there are essentially two levels that you see. So at the very top is the cabins that you see where it's labeled 1 and 2. And the bottom you have 2 workspaces where they each have computers, as well as an airlock which doubles up as their toilet and shower area where they can also go outside from. So number 1 is the circadian system, and I've got 2 photos in the next slide which I'll show you. And this is essentially a bunch of LED panels in the top of the ceiling of the habitat. In essence, they want to mimic sunlight and the day and night system using LED panels, which, as I mentioned earlier, when you are in the peaks of eternal light on the moon, or if you're in the Arctic where you do have where the sun doesn't set sometimes, they want to test out how efficient these panels are. And you can just see the difference between this cold industrial king light on the left here and the warm hues of dusk and dawn on the right. So this is the capabilities of the panels, and I'm really excited to see how effective they are. Right now I've got no idea, but I'm really excited to see what the guys say when they come back. Of course, if you've got a lot of sunlight, it makes sense to have a lot of solar panels. So the entire outer shell of the habitat is filled with solar panels which will power the habitat. I believe they also have a generator in cases of backup energy power, but I think for the most part they will meet all their demands with those solar panels. Number 3 is an unfolding architecture to minimize mass and volume during transportation and then maximize it on site, and I'll show you a demonstration of that later. A 3D printer, number 4. This is because a large majority of the components within the habitat are 3D printed, and this was really exciting to see. And they have a digital twin, I think they labeled it, of the habitat, and they can monitor where certain things are perhaps breaking or not as reliable, and they can try and replace these with 3D printing, which is is an interesting concept. I think it's fascinating. Number 5, vertical farm. So they're going to be growing plants during their stay there. I will touch on this in the second part of the presentation. And essentially they'll be growing plants, and it's just a fantastic way to break the monotony of the environment around them, because obviously it's a lot of white, it's a lot of grays. And inside the habitat, obviously you have the different hues and colors of the circadian system, but it also adds that element of nature, which is fantastic, which is also related to number 7, which is this algae-based life support system. Personally, I don't know too many details about that, sadly, so you'd have to check that out on the website itself. But again, adds this element of nature within the habitat. And then at the bottom of the habitat, you have batteries, water, and stowage. Again, you can see the wonderful panels. This is the expandable element of the habitat in demo form, obviously, and it has worked for both the prototype and the final habitat itself. And it essentially expands by 560% by volume. And if you think about the benefits of this, is because you can shrink it down to its compressible size, stick it in a container, which is what we did, and then ship it over to Greenland. Or if you're doing it in space, right now, if you're working within the constraints of a Falcon Heavy, or in the future, say, a Vulcan or a Starship, you can launch really compressed habitats and expand them to fantastic sizes when they are up in space, in orbit, on Moon, Mars, so on. So this was a really exciting demonstration. I mentioned the digital twin earlier, and it's a digital model of the habitat which looks to trace life support, heat, water, electricity, all those demands, and if there is something wrong, they can track it and maybe see if they can do anything about it in advance to prevent any significant failures from happening. The circadian system, comprised of those panels that I mentioned earlier, creating an artificial day and night cycle to see if that can balance the natural needs of the body and sleep. In addition to the circadian system, we have a weather simulator which incorporates also some sound systems, again to try and break the monotony and have days that are out of the ordinary. Perhaps you have a storm, perhaps you have a very sunny day, and I guess if you've been to these 4D movies, it's kind of like that, but a bit more developed. And then finally, the algae reactor, which can absorb cosmic radiation. It's highly photosynthetic and it's nutritious, and they'll test of how effective that is in regards to providing all those benefits. Again, I know less about this, that is not my area at all. And here is the final habitat itself. So you can see Sebastian on the right there and Carl on the left. And these photos were taken in August, just before they left for Greenland. And this was built in a beta factory in Copenhagen. So you can see the habitat there in its expanded form. And you can see that it's no easy feat to live in that kind of enclosed environment for 3 months, but they're doing it. And I'm really excited to see when they come back what their experiences will be. In regards to research, a lot of my role as the space psychologist lead within the team is to both facilitate internal and external research. Internally, we're going to be looking at the effectiveness of the circadian system, the natural elements such as the vertical farm and the algae bioreactor. Again, I know little about the algae bioreactor, but from a psychological point of view, we can assess the effectiveness of these countermeasures that the team have included. Externally, we've got researchers from the University of Minnesota, the Danish military, University of Surrey, Manchester, as well as the University of Milano, I think. A whole bunch of psychologists across the globe who have given us a wide variety of studies looking into group conflict, well-being, that kind of thing. And again, it's going to be very interesting to see how the crew have fared over their 3 months, a significant amount of time by themselves. And you can just look through the list there. And the slides, I believe, will be sent, so feel free to go through these and contact us for our website if you are interested in further information. And again, I did mention the documentary. This will be, I think it's a 6-part series about the creation of the habitat, the construction, and then the mission itself. So you will have the whole process of LUNARK to your viewing pleasure. And hopefully in the sections that do cover the actual mission itself, we might see some Mark Watney style videos a la Martian from Sebastian and Carl, which should be awesome. And we've got a whole bunch of partners that we are incredibly thankful for, who have either committed materials or certain resources that have made this project a success. And we are just incredibly thankful to everyone. And these are only just a certain selection of, you can see the full list on our website, but we are very much indebted to their support and we thank them. And here are just some of the previous projects that Saga built. This is a laboratory that was for DMARS in Israel, a Martian analog, and this was just to create some additional space for the team there. And this is again an expandable habitat. And the green tubes that you see there are prototype algae photobioreactors. And some of the projects that Saga Space Architects have won are the Marstopia with their dandelion shelter, which was one of the foundations for their inspiration in going that next step and doing Project LUNARK. And I think some of the inspirations that they took from this project to what we have right now with LUNARK. And similarly, they won the Moon Village Association's architecture competition about a lunar habitat, which is also directly relevant. So in turn, that covers the main part of the mission, and that covers the first section of this presentation, which covers an overview of the project itself from start to finish, what we aim to do with it and why it's important to us. And now I'll link in some of the space psychological elements that can be relevant to the project. So space psychology, you might also have heard in a similar kind of umbrella term, extreme environment psychology, or more commonly known as isolated and confined environments, or ICES. I realize ICE has many abbreviations and acronyms, so put that to one side. Isolated and confined environments. What do we mean by those? Well, just to give some kind of examples, astronauts, obviously this is a space symposium, that's the forefront of our mind. Submariners, people in nuclear submarines who live there for months on end, and also people who live and work in the Arctic and Antarctic. You have Concordia in Antarctica, for instance, but you also have people who live in the Arctic, natives as well. So when you start to consider similarities and differences between what constitutes an isolated and confined environment, there are many, but there are differences between them. So just for instance, if you think about the International Space Station, the group size that you have there, sometimes you have 3 astronauts, sometimes you have 6, or sometimes even more, but less than 12. That number will vary compared to other locations. So for instance, in Antarctica, you can have communities far larger than that. Same with submarines, you can have crews that vary in size as well. So I think what I'm trying to say here is you have to look at the context of each extreme environment differently, because although they do share these common factors of isolation and monotony and perhaps distance from others, you will have differences in the fact that you will have communities in Antarctica, whereas in the International Space Station, for instance, it's just a small crew. And similarly to lighting and space, I guarantee you they have a lot less space in the International Space Station because they can't leave, the exception of EVAs, of course, whereas in places like the Arctic and the Antarctic, you can sometimes leave your habitat and have a bit of a wander or exploration. So that's just to give you an idea that context is important in regards to isolated and confined environments, and there are certain similarities and differences. And in this notion of context, at least in my opinion, I know that's the opinion of several others in the field as well, is that you have to consider other factors in play, especially if you want to get to the source of a potential problem. So in the case of LUNARK, for instance, you have this model of the biopsychosocial model in general, but if we apply that to LUNARK, and especially if we think about when they have this permanent sunlight for over a month, if that does eventually start to play with their sleep cycle, their circadian rhythms, and if they do start losing sleep from the biological aspect, that then shifts into the psychological, because you might get grumpy, you might be working less efficiently, and you might be getting more frustrated. And in terms, if you move that onto the social element, if you are getting frustrated, conflict between the crew, and in this case it's a crew of 2, by the way, Sebastian and Carl are the only ones in the habitat, that might lead to some social issues. So that's just one example of how you have this interplay between biology, psychology, and the social element, and I think that's very important. That being said, for the rest of this presentation, we will be focusing solely on the psychological elements. And the way I like to explain space psychology is in the phases of a mission. So during the pre-mission phase, before the mission's even started itself, you select the crew and you train them. During the mission, you monitor their well-being and you provide countermeasures for any potential sources of stress, the stresses they have. And then post-mission, you have the debriefing and the recovery phase. So that's just a basic overview of how I like to see space psychology, in my eyes at least. Pre-mission, I think it's important to note and distinguish that Carl and Sebastian are self-selected. This is not typical of most extreme environment missions. With that being said, just to touch on this, again, context matters. The mission that you have in mind can really implicate the selection that you conduct. So think back to the early 50s, 60s when you had the Mercury missions, the Gemini missions, which are just crews of 1 or 2 people who are doing suborbital and orbital missions for a few days. Those personalities, when you think about The Right Stuff as the movie and the book, you have these kind of hotshot pilots, kind of low-key arrogant, very gung-ho personalities. Those personalities very much differ from the personalities that we have today, where we have crew on the ISS who are in low Earth orbit for around 6 months at a time, sometimes less, sometimes a bit more even. And in turn, you have different personalities. You have people who are very technically competent and confident to the point where they will fight to solve issues that arise, and you will still have those kind of competencies in those on the ISS, but you also need to ensure that people are going to work together, which was also factored in when you start considering the Apollo missions as well. But you can kind of see this progression of when the environment changes, so from low Earth orbit to moon, and then longer stays, so distance and duration can really impact the considerations that you have for a crew, as well as the number as well. So that's just touching on selection. You tailor your selection to the mission. That's what I'm trying to say. But that being said, this crew are self-selected, so let's skip past that. Training. Again, you tailor the training to the mission at hand, and this is exactly what the crew have done. They've been through Arctic survival training with the Danish military. I myself have walked them through psychological theories and countermeasures countermeasures to kind of increase their understanding of communication and well-being and those sorts of topics. So they are, to the best of what we could provide, well paired for the rigors that the Arctic will provide them. Also, I'd like to touch on the fact that Sebastian and Carl, who again, you can see their beautiful faces here on the left, they have been working together for a very long time. And I think, in fact, I would have selected them because they work very closely together. They are very patient with one another. They respect each other a lot, and they're just a fantastic crew. So I think they'll do very well. Knock on wood. I can't wait to see them come back safe and sound during the mission. And here are just some of the potential stressors and issues that you face in deep space missions. So Moon and Mars. Duration and distance, like I mentioned, if it takes a few minutes to get into low Earth orbit, to get to the Moon, it's 3 days. To get to Mars, even longer, matter of months. Delay of communication with Earth, again, I think it's a matter of seconds between here and the Moon. With Mars, it's from 4 to 22 minutes. That will implicate the senses of isolation and autonomy, because on Mars, you're going to be by yourself. If certain things go wrong, you have to be dependent. You can't get that support from Earth. On the Moon, it's a bit easier. You still have that awkward time delay, but it's still manageable. But at the very least, you are still 3 days away from help. So that increases the level of autonomy that you need to have in mind. Resupply, crew rotations. Again, this won't be happening with our mission with LUNARK. Limited volume and confinement. That will be happening in LUNARK because the habitat is quite constrained and quite small. Earth out of view phenomenon. Obviously, we won't have that. But if you think when you are on Mars, the Earth, when it is even in view, it will appear like a speck. When you're on the Moon, you might sometimes see it, but it will be smaller. You know, the Earth is a marble analogy, and you'll have that lovely Earthrise that will happen, which very much differs from how it is on the ISS, where you are permanently orbiting and you see the vast and the slight curvature of the Earth from above. And again, that places different implications on the psychological aspect. And particularly you see here sleep, fatigue, workload, and circadian stress. That is the main thing that they want to be testing with their circadian panels. And they also have wearables which will track the amount of time that they have slept and so on. As I mentioned here, some of the challenges concerning group dynamics, monotony, given that they are in such a remote area in the world, danger, and the weather. So those are some of the challenges, again, just to reiterate. And during the mission itself, this is where some of the countermeasures are really key. So like I mentioned with the circadian panels, they will try and counteract difficulties faced through permanent sunlight, but particularly when you consider the vertical file number 5 and the algae life support system, this relates to something called the biophilia hypothesis, which I realize sounds a lot like jargon, but basically what it means is that humans have an intrinsic need to interact with nature and be surrounded by nature. And this is one of the main ethos of the design of the habitat, is to include natural elements. So in turn, if you have this kind of control and responsibility to look after a plant in such a dangerous environment where you don't feel like you have much control, looking after something else might be able to have like an outlet to relieve stress and have responsibility and control in one area where there might not be so much. I've heard of people saying, oh, why can't we bring pets in space? Well, this is the next best thing. And in turn, you can also you can touch the plant. There's a certain smell. So if you do tomatoes, for instance, there's a certain smell. You can eat them, of course, which is what they aim to be doing with the algae photobioreactor and the vertical farm. So that's just one countermeasure that we've included. The second one there, Drift Extremes. This is a digital tool developed by Dr. Nathan Smith and colleagues at the University of Manchester. It's an app on the phone, and it can monitor and provide guidance for psychological well-being. And this is still in its early phases, but we hope to see some success with that and hope it's very useful for the crew as well during their time. Care packages. This is an idea from the International Space Station, and this is where you have resupplies with little care packages from family and friends who are looking to give a morale boost to crew. So what we've done, obviously we're not going to resupply the habitat when it's in Greenland, but we have preloaded the habitat with a whole bunch of things from friends, family, myself as well, and we have scheduled these out throughout the mission so if they are going through a down period, they can open the package and get that boost from seeing something from a loved one. And these are apparently a huge success for NASA as well as other agencies, so we're really hoping to see the similar success in our mission. Entertainment, they will have films, they'll have books. I've written a whole bunch of short sci-fi stories for them, probably not that great, but as long as they have fun, that's what matters, right? And then also wearables to help track their well-being. And just to summarize and finish off, there will be a debrief once they come back. There will be access to psychological support and counseling if they so need it. We will sit down with them and talk about their entire experience in relation to the countermeasures as well as their own personal thoughts. And then we'll share the story with others as well to see how we can best go forward with future isolation missions, but particularly lunar missions, which is what this whole project is about. And again, we have this motto in Saga: let's accelerate human space exploration together. I personally, for one, this is why I'm involved with the industry. I find it fascinating. I think it brings out the best of us in working together. I've had the fantastic opportunity to work with people all across the globe with this kind of passion for space, and it's just been an absolute pleasure to A, talk in this symposium, so thank you again, and B, be part of Saga. So do get in touch with myself or the Saga team if you are interested in taking part. And otherwise, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a fantastic day.
the actual habitat, it is actually 17.2 meters cubed, which really is not a lot for two different people to be stuck in. So it's impressive stuff. Let's move on to the next one. It's a great honor, actually, to introduce one of the titans in our field. Next up, we have Professor Russomano. She's an internal medicine and emergency doctor from Brazil with 30 years of experience in aerospace medicine sciences, as well as telemedicine and digital health. She has a master's and PhD in space physiology, has worked at DLR in Germany before establishing coordinating the Microgravity Center, PCRS, in Brazil for the last 18 years. She has multiple university appointments and is an elected academician for the International Academy of Aviation and Space Medicine and the International Academy of Astronautics. She's a voluntary mentor for Space Women, which is a UNUSA initiative, and is co-founder and CEO of Innova Space UK. So we'll hear from her now on how humans live in outer space, challenges and achievements.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I will present in the next 40-45 minutes how humans live and work and adapt to outer space, some of the challenges, some of the achievements in the area of space medicine, space life science, which is my area of activity. So let's go back in time, back in 1961, when Gagarin went into space, 12 April 1961. And at that time, we have to confess that there was a huge lack of knowledge in the area of space physiology and medicine. We couldn't predict exactly what would happen to Gagarin during his flight, although it was a very short flight, 108 minutes only. It was like a kind of black hole, let's say, in terms of knowledge in relation to the human physiology, microgravity. So a list of possible things that could happen to Gagarin was created. And you could see, I just want to call the attention that some of the possible signs and symptoms are very contradictory. They are basically the opposite. So urinary retention, for example, and increased urinary flow, or hypertension and hypotension. So it shows how much we did not know at that time. Of course, there was a huge evolution since 1961, and now you know much more, and I will present some of what is, let's say, achieved in this area. But one important aspect that I want to call your attention is the environment that the astronaut is exposed during a space mission, because this is extremely important. It's not just the microgravity or radiation of space. You have the environment itself, like the atmosphere and the barometric pressure and so on. So if you look at this slide, you can see the evolution in the American program from the first projects, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, and also the Skylab, where the barometric pressure was very low and the pressure of the oxygen content was very high. So this is a way to try to avoid one of the effects of lowering the barometric pressure, which is hypoxia, the less offer of oxygen to the body. So by 1981, when the space shuttle started, the program started in America, and now with the ISS, the space engineers were able to basically recreate the environment of Earth in a spacecraft. So you have a barometric pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury, 1 atm. We will have 20% oxygen, 8% nitrogen. Temperature is controlled. CO2 is not perfectly controlled. In our atmosphere, it's extremely low, and it's a type of gas that's damaged to humans. And so, unfortunately, it has to improve a bit more. In a spacecraft, it can be 10 to 15 times what we have here on Earth. But in general terms, let's say the atmosphere of the spacecraft is what we have here on Earth. And then for someone like me that studies the human adaptation to space flight, we are left with four main things: the effect of microgravity in our body from cell to big systems, the effect of radiation, again, from cells to big systems, and some of psychosocial aspects of the trip that was just discussed, briefly discussed before in the previous presentation, so related to isolation, confinement, and so on, and the disruption of the circadian rhythm, which is our biological rhythm in 24 hours. You know that the spacecraft or space station is orbiting the Earth about 400 kilometers of altitude at a speed of 27,000 kilometers per hour, which gives astronauts 16 sunsets and 16 sunrises in 24 hours, which is very disruptive for our biological rhythm. And of course, if you go to Mars one day, or the Moon, I just take Mars as an example because it's a bit more extreme. We also have to add, in terms of research, and they need to understand how humans adapt the characteristics of the planet, of the celestial body. And of course, Mars has a very low barometric pressure. It has a very thin atmosphere, but it's mainly CO2, very, very low oxygen, temperature is, well, it's like minus 60, minus 63 degrees centigrade. You have sandstorms, and psychologically you're going to see Earth from Mars as we see Mars from Earth, just a dot in space, which is could be very damaging for your psychological, let's say, adaptation to Mars. So in terms of change that can happen in our body, we have, here is just a chart, a figure that shows different body systems reacting to the environment of space over time. And you can see that there are systems that react very quickly and they adapt very quickly, some that continuously changing, so it's a chronic change, and there are some that change slowly, not that as acute than some system and not as chronic as others, and then also adapt after a while. So there is this understanding that after 1 month and a month and a half in space, you're going to be more like a space being, like your physiology or human physiology are more adapted to microgravity. So one of these first systems to react, the neurovestibular system, and then the cardiopulmonary system. But what I want to call the attention here is that these systems, they have a kind of point of adaptation, but there are systems like the bone system and muscle system that are continuous, let's say, changing pace. And if you do not do anything during the mission, then it's going to be very detrimental for the astronauts in the space flight and when they return to Earth. So let's divide it then in short-term effects of the space environment on human physiology and long-term effect. And here you can see that this shift of blood, and I'll explain a bit better, the cardiovascular changes are happen immediately after you are inserted in microgravity, and continues happening in a week or 10 days. The neurovestibular changes that I'm also going to mention briefly later on. Back pain, anxiety, let's say, or psychosocial aspects of being in space. And then you have the long-term effects like the change in the pressure in your brain, visual problems that is probably connected to this change in intracranial pressure, bone loss, muscle loss, radiation effects. So you have, let's say, when you prepare someone for a mission, when you select or train, you have basically understand the mission itself, of course, but also how long the mission is going to be, because you're going to have different, let's say, presentations of this adaptation to space, acute and long-term present change. So let's take the first one, neurovestibular change. Space motion sickness affects 70% of astronauts during the first 72 hours of space missions. Of course, this can affect for longer. There are people that doesn't adapt to microgravity in terms of vestibular system. This is more or less like when you travel by car or sometimes by boat, and then you feel nausea, or sometimes you vomit and feel, let's say, that you are unwell, lack of performance, sweat. So this is basically what happens to astronauts in space. That's why EVAs, extravehicular activities, should not be performed in the first 72 hours of a space flight unless there is an emergency. And this is caused because there is a huge disorientation. The vestibular system that is in our inner ear is affected by the lack of gravity. Part of its work depends on gravity. So there is a mismatch of information between your eyes and your vestibular system to the brain. The eyes tells the brain you are upside down because you can see, and the vestibular system says no, you are not upside down. And then this mismatch of information apparently makes the brain sick, and then you have the signs and symptoms of motion sickness. In terms of cardiopulmonary system, very well studied. In fact, it's two systems that there is a good comprehension, not complete, but a good comprehension of what happens in microgravity. So initially you have this shift of blood towards your head and torso, increasing the size of your heart. So this is the second man here standing. You have the increase in the heart because we have about 5 liters of blood in our body, and from the lower limbs to the upper limbs, due to the lack of gravity, about 2 liters have shifted to the upper body. So you have a period that you have to for adaptation in microgravity where you lose part of the liquid part of the blood called plasma, about 12 to 20% of the plasma of our blood. The blood depends on the studies that measure it, and then your heart becomes smaller, more atrophic. When you come back to Earth, then you have an issue to stand up, for example. It's more difficult to control blood pressure. You have less blood in your body circulating in your body. So you have an adaptation to space flight, and then you have issues after flight. So this system is pretty much affected when you come back to Earth. And when you are in space, especially here in this phase 2, this man here is standing 2 and 3, you have this called syndrome, puffy face and bird leg syndrome. Puffy face because you have more blood in your upper body, making your, let's say, face more rounded. And you have bird legs because the blood shifts from your lower limbs, and then the legs become very thin. You can see the picture here comparing pre-flight and during flight of both astronauts. This changing in our cardiovascular system has a very simple explanation. We are beings that walk on 2 legs. And if you consider a dog, for example, that has 4 legs, you have a completely different reaction, because 70% of our blood is below our heart level. And for dogs, for example, we have 70% of our blood above heart level. So this column of blood is somehow problematic when you go into space. And also pressures will change, of course. If you change the distribution of your, the way that the blood is distributed in your body, you are going to have changes in blood pressure, venous and arterial blood pressure. But taking the arterial side here, you can see that our blood pressure here on Earth changed from 70 millimeters of mercury at our head level, goes to about 100 at our heart level, and then 200 at our feet. If you are in microgravity, supposedly you are going to have a homogeneous distribution of blood pressure. In fact, it doesn't matter in the position that you are. Here on Earth, when I stand up or when we leave bed in the morning, when we change positions, we have systems that control the blood pressure to keep the blood pressure in a good level, for us to function. And in space, this system of controlling blood pressure basically does not exist, because it doesn't matter the position that you are, pressures will be the same. Of course, it also affects the pressure in the brain, in the eye, so intraocular pressure increases in space initially, and then the intracranial pressure, we have to understand it a bit more, how it happens, what happens in fact to the intraocular pressure. But it's been identified that especially male astronauts, after being in space for 6 months, have a change in their optic nerve in their eyes and visual issues, and this could be pretty much related to the increase in intracranial pressure. Other changes that have been also recently seen is that the flow of blood, from let's say from our head to our heart through big veins, called one of them is called the intrajugular vein, does not happen as it happens here on Earth. So gravity plays an important issue here, and there is a kind of the flow, let's say, in our veins could stop completely. Now it doesn't move, or it can be even reversed. The veins, as you know, should bring the blood from our body to the heart, and in this case it is reversed. The flow is reversed. There was an identification of a thrombus in one of these one astronaut that had to be treated in space. A thrombus is basically a way to block, a plaque that block the flow of blood, and so it's a very serious situation, and he was then treated in space during his mission. Bones and muscles also change in space, as I just mentioned. We have a different posture in space called the semi-fetal posture. You can see the astronaut here in the back, a lady with a pink shirt. She is with the arms go a bit forward, the legs go up, and then you are in this semi-fetal position, more or less like when you are in a pool, a deep pool, and then you cannot touch the floor, and then you have assume a bit of this position. Of course, there you have the mean of the water, and in space you have just air. Because gravity also plays a role in our height. If you measure yourself in the morning, you are going to be a bit taller than when you measure yourself at night, because there is a change in the size of the soft tissue around the bones of our spine. So in space, because there is no gravity, you basically elongate your spine, and it can cause lots of back pain, lower back pain, lumbar back pain, and this increase could be up to 6 to 8 centimeters, although it's in general is less than that. In terms of the bones, the bones that are much more affected are the bones in our lower body, as the muscles in fact, and in the lower body we have basically legs and the pelvis, but especially legs and feet are pretty much affected by the lack of gravity, because you have no stimulation for the bones to be formed. So it will depend on the duration of exposure. Of course, remember that I said there are acute exposure and chronic exposures to microgravity. So after a month, 2 months, 3 months, it's going to be, of course, worse than the first 2 weeks. And it is very pronounced, the change. It is the loss of bone mass. You can see in this picture that, as I say, in our lower limbs, you can have even bones losing about 2% of bone mass in a month, which is a lot, because if you have a postmenopausal woman losing bone mass in a year, and if she loses about 1%, it's already concerning. So 2% in a month is astonishing. It's something overwhelming. It's not something that's good for the astronauts in long term and when they come back to Earth. So here is just some data of from ESA and NASA, but basically is that something very concerning to us. A way to overcome that is to exercise, and I briefly touch that in a moment. And of course, there are lots of individual variation. Muscles, again, as the bones, you will have a change in especially the skeletal muscles of our lower limbs. because again, we are not counteract gravity as you move around. And there is also a change, a transition of slow twitch endurance fibers, type 1 fibers, to a fast twitch fibers, which are more needed to push yourself around the, let's say, the surfaces of the space station, and they stand, which is type 2 fibers, but type 1 fiber is much more used for standing. So in space, you have a decrease in power, strength, fiber size, and mass. So you have muscle atrophy, which can be very deleterious for your, not just for your well-being, your health, but also in case of emergency. So these are two areas that are two body systems that don't adapt to microgravity unless you have to do something, in fact, to counteract the effects of microgravity. So here you have the exercise device that you have at ISS nowadays. It is the ARED, Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, treadmill and cycloergometer. They have different functions, like the treadmill is very important to improve locomotion, to act in your cardiovascular system, to improve, let's say, your aerobic fitness, as the cycloergometer as well. Plus, the very important one is the ARED, because you in space there is no weight, as we know. Then let's say when you go to the gym here on Earth, you just use weights to improve the strength of your muscle, make the muscle stronger and bigger. And in space, you have to use resistance to replace the weight of an equipment. So these are basically the three equipment that we have in space. Astronauts have to exercise about 2 hours a day, 6 days per week. So it's very important. I think that this study I like very much because I mentioned a couple of times, individual variation is always present. We have a very small number of astronauts per space flight. For medical, biological experiments, it's not very good. It's sometimes difficult to combine data from different space missions because people are very different. They have different ages, different backgrounds, different levels of health and fitness. So it is complicated to merge, let's say, the data from different space flights. And this one, although it was just one set of twins, one stayed here on Earth, one went into space. And so it's interesting to see the results now that have been published, because they compare these two men, two astronauts, to very healthy and fit people. And genetics is not, let's say, an issue there because, of course, they are twins. So we can try to understand a bit more this change between what happened to someone in microgravity for a period of almost a year that Scott Kelly stayed there for 340 days at the ISS. Other areas that are coming in is, let's say, I just come here with an example, astronaut microbiota. We know that in space there is a change in diet, there is a change in metabolism, we are exposed to radiation and microgravity, and all these, let's say, stressors have been shown to reduce the bacteria in our diversity and the composition of the bacteria in our intestines, which can then, of course, affect many different systems, including, for example, the immune system, which is very important because in space we know that the immune system decreases because of the exposure to microgravity and possibly other issues like the change in microbiota. In terms of the human mind in space, it's a very, very complex subject. It's very difficult to really simulate that here on Earth. We have, so space psychology and space psychiatry is I believe, especially for long-term missions, are two areas that are extremely important. We have different stressors for different astronauts. Some complain about being isolated. Some say that, especially in long-term missions, is very monotonous. So after a while, they are not tired of being in space, but less motivated, let's say. It seems it's not that exciting. And some have, in fact, suffered from depression. Insomnia is very common because in space it's not easy to get, to sleep. The sleep, let's say, the sleep pattern in space changes. Even if the astronaut is asked to sleep for the same number of hours that they sleep here on Earth, in general, they sleep less in space. The change in the pattern of the REM and no REM phase cycles of sleep is also changed. So there are many aspects that can really affect the astronauts, plus the communication or the dynamics among the crew. People come from different nationalities, different languages, different cultures, different professional backgrounds and gender, and then it can really cause some disturbance or conflict during the mission. So it's a very important area because mental and psychological stability, emotional stability is mandatory for the success of a space mission. And also now something that I want to bring in is that we have different effects of all these space stressors, microgravity, radiation, so on. They act very different if you consider men and women. And as I used to say, as a space scientist, I can, looking at the data, you know that more or less we have more or less 570 astronauts or space travelers in total, and 11% are women. And of course, what we understand, we don't have a good picture still about what happens to human body in space in terms, let's say, of how we respond to medication, the gastrointestinal system, the endocrine system, the immune system. So there are still lots of things to better understand, but we are focusing on male subjects. So we have a good idea of male response to the environment of space, and not as much of the female response to that. And just here you can see, just point out some of the difference in terms of cognition response, muscle response, hormonal response, and so on. So we need to improve this knowledge regarding women. In my career, I have developed many studies, conduct many studies in microgravity and hypogravity simulations, and I always try to have subjects, two sets of subjects, men and women, to at least improve the knowledge that we can have during simulations here on Earth. So what is needed if our body is basically affected from cell to body systems to our mind by microgravity, radiation, so on? We need, first of all, of course, training. We need to not necessarily are going to have doctors in space flight. I believe that to Mars we are going to have one, but normally at the ISS we do not have doctors on board. And then the astronauts must get some training, understand a bit about space physiology, what's going to happen to their bodies and the bodies of their colleagues in space, and also be able to perform some minor medical procedures and or to collect data from other astronauts, the medical data to be transmitted to Earth, because of course telemedicine, telehealth is the way to go during a space mission. So this has to be trained as well. Believe me that when you are in microgravity, and I had the opportunity to participate in 2 parabolic flights of the European Space Agency, we lose lots of our, not just the balance, orientation, but everything becomes different. The way that you move, the way that you coordinate your body. So it's very important to acquire some experience in collecting data, medical data, to be transmitted to Earth if you are in parabolic flight, so you know how to proceed in microgravity. And just as a curiosity, the first medical exam transmitted on Earth was done by Beethoven, a Dutch medical doctor who invented the ECG, the electrocardiogram. 60 years later, more or less, Gagarin, his first manned space flight, we had the ECG of Gagarin was transmitted to Earth. So it's quite an interesting comparison, a coincidence somehow. And it's a very important exam that can tell you lots of aspects related to the heart, the cardiovascular system, and your well-being in space or here on Earth if you are suffering from a disease. But this is also important also the message here is that telemedicine, telehealth did not start with space flight. It's something that people sometimes are not aware. People that are not from the area specifically, they are not aware that didn't start space flight, started much before that. This is just an example. But it had because it's the way to treat astronauts in space, it was boosted during the space flight era. So what is important is to consider some aspects related to communication, quality of data acquisition and transmission. And if you look here, of course, the ISS or the space shuttle spacecraft that is in low Earth orbit, we can have a real-time communication with doctors here on Earth. So it is very important for medical data, for the collection of medical data related to the adaptation of the body to microgravity, the body and the mind to microgravity. So you can have this data of how the astronauts are responding to the stressors of space. And you can, of course, as a doctor, you can identify some clinical change, and guide the astronauts on the mission of what to do. And also, especially, very important, to act during a space emergency. But when you go to Mars, then we are going to have a huge issue, because you have some aspects of the mission, and we go from microgravity for 6 months of microgravity and radiation to hypogravity, although it's not the same as here. We know that's about a third of the Earth's gravity is still another stressor, plus other things that I mentioned before, the distance, that is to see Earth from Mars like just as a dot, so psychologically it can be very disruptive. And you have the distance again affecting the telecommunication, the communication between the two planets, and ranging for 3 minutes delay each way to up to 22 minutes of of delay in the communication depend on the proximity of the two planets. So 55 million kilometers is the shortest distance, and you can go 400 million kilometers. So solutions for that, you have to have astronauts trained to collect data, as I mentioned, to perform some medical procedures, and also have, for example, the help of the 3D printer to create some medical tools or even dental tools if there is the need for that. So you have to have a crew that's more autonomous, independent from the ground, and it's pretty much it's very difficult. I worked for a couple of years in ambulances. I am, as you know, I'm Brazilian. In Brazil, ambulances must have doctors on board, and the medicine, extra hospital medicine, is extremely difficult because you do not have the whole support of the infrastructure of the hospital in terms of human resource, equipment, and so on. So if you are in space, you are going to need some help. Earth is going to be too far. So you need to have, in my opinion, robots capable of performing procedures, capable of guiding astronauts in terms of diagnose and at least the first steps in terms of treatment. And so I think that the artificial intelligence, the very smart algorithms in the area of health and medicine will be extremely important. And of course, space tourism is coming, I would say, more popular. Because when people talk about space tourism, they say, oh, we are starting space tourism. Space tourism is been going on since 2001, when Dennis Tito went into space. He was an American engineer, 61 years old. And then it showed one aspect that this first phase of space tourism showed us, 2001, 2009, when people went to the ISS, is that we are going to deal with a very different bunch of people. People are going to be less fit, possibly sick, and older travelers. And this will create many different challenges to space doctors, space scientists. We can see here Steve Hawking, someone that had a very important motor disease, neuromotor disease, in a parabolic flight without someone that was not capable, let's say, of breathing or talk or move by himself. So he had lots of medical issues and consequence of his disease. And even with that, it was possible for him to experience microgravity in a parabolic flight. So now we are dealing with people that are famous, are rich, that want to go into space, and they can waiver themselves in missions to the lower Earth orbit. So we have the first company, Space Adventure, that took the space tourists to the ISS. Even the term space tourist is kind of controversial, but in any case, let's call it like that by now. We have parabolic flights that we can use for recreational activities, and the three big companies, there are others, but these three big companies like Virgin Galactic, SpaceX, and Blue Origin, that wants to take humans to low Earth orbit or the edge of space for very short periods of time. And by now, the regulation, medical aspects being discussed, is a concern somehow for the medical community that works in the space area. But in any case, nowadays, as I said, you can waiver yourself and you just go. One important aspect for this understanding of what happens to the body in space is ground-based studies in universities, space agencies, and also the use of parabolic flight. So this is how a parabolic flight of the European Space Agency is designed. You have a campaign that is like 3 days of parabolic flights. In each day of the campaign, you have 6 sets of 5 parabolas in each one, where you go from hypergravity to microgravity to hypergravity again, and then 1G. So you have time to perform your experiments, to change subjects in intervals between this set of parabolas. So just very briefly here, this is just an animation showing the parabolic flight itself. I think that's very important to feel that, to experience microgravity. In this one in 2000, we are conducting a study related to the cardiopulmonary resuscitation in microgravity, as you do not have the weight of your body to perform chest compressions, so you need to use the flexion and extension of your elbows to try to compensate for that. And so, just finalizing, I just want to show one thing that I also believe that's very important for the adaptation or for the medical care in space, is to develop techniques and new ways to basically medically evaluate astronauts in microgravity. And I had the opportunity, based on my PhD thesis here at King's College here in London, to develop an equipment that is called the blood collector. Now we use the ear to collect blood, not the veins, not the arteries. In space, you can collect blood from the veins. There is no collection from arteries because it's a more painful and more difficult technique to be performed. We call this project Van Gogh because Van Gogh one day cut his ear in a moment of madness, and then we call that the Van Gogh project. We had people from Brazil, had people from from the UK, working together, King's College and the University in Brazil. So here is the technique. You arterialize the earlobe by massage with a vasodilating cream. You clean it up, and then you have the blood collector attached. You collect the blood and then analyze the blood. And this is our parabolic flight. We had to have this hood to protect possibly the environment of the airplane during the blood collection. So we didn't know how the blood collector would behave in microgravity, if the capillary action would happen here on Earth. So we had to protect somehow the airplane. So to finalize that, something that would be interesting to see the blood collector work in microgravity. Is a very unique technique. But thank you very much, and I hope you have enjoyed the presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was illuminating. Time, we have to move on to the next presentation. So I'll start to the introduction for the next person, which is Dr. Bergita Ganse. She is an orthopedic surgeon and physiologist, which I thought was an oxymoron, with a research focus on space medicine and the musculoskeletal system in spaceflight. She got a doctorate from Lübeck and a postdoctoral from RWTH Aachen University in Germany. She's a research fellow at Manchester Metropolitan University in UK, funded by the German Research Foundation, and co-investigator of an ISS experiment involved in large international studies working with the German Aerospace Center, ESA, and NASA. She'll be talking about muscular research and bed rest studies, and I'll hand over to her.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, actually. It's morning in Germany. Yeah, thank you, Thais, for giving such an amazing overview. And my talk is now going to be a little bit more specific about bed rest studies. And I've been involved with musculoskeletal research in bed rest studies for about 12 years now. A little bit about my background first, because just as you said, it's a bit strange that I'm a physiologist and an orthopedic surgeon. But in my country, physiologists are medical doctors. There is no physiology course at university. So if you want to become a physiology, you do a physiology residency. That is a 4-year residency, and I completed that at the German Aerospace Center in Cologne, and in Berlin there's a space medicine center in Charité University Hospital. And I also completed an orthopedic surgery residency, which is 6 years in Germany. And I'm also, and that's where it becomes weird for Commonwealth people, I'm also an emergency and sport physician, but those are not residencies. So emergency and sport medicine are on top trainings that you do in addition to a full residency. So yeah, I know that's a bit uncommon. Actually, this is probably still in the way, is it? So my research focuses on space medicine and the musculoskeletal system in spaceflight, immobilization, and also aging, because there are a lot of things happening in aging that also happen in spaceflight. So it's very good to look at both together. And so my main research comes in bed rest studies, which is why I'm today talking about bed rest studies and giving an introduction. But also now got an ISS experiment together with some international colleagues, of course. If you ever want to apply for an ISS experiment, it's important to have an international group of people involved. And currently, as already introduced, I've got a fellowship grant of the German Research Council to conduct bed rest research. And I previously worked, I graduated in 2007 from med school and then started to work at the Center for Space Medicine in Berlin, followed by a 2-year orthopedic surgery period where I completed the basic training in orthopedic surgery in Cologne University Hospital. And after that, I worked at the German Space Agency for 3 years as head medical doctor for bed rest studies, but I was also involved in a ton of other studies, met 1 million people, and it was just a very good time, a very, very productive residency, because it gets you to know all the features of space medicine and just meet everyone who's relevant in the field. And then I decided afterwards to complete my orthopedic surgery training as well, because I found it's amazing to have both. And I just completed that last year in January and then moved on to my fellowship grant, or to my fellowship. Now I will start to talk about a little bit about bed rest studies, and after that I will show you some examples of experiments we have conducted on musculoskeletal topics. So first of all, bed rest studies are a wonderful analog for space flight. Of course, it's not the same, but it's a wonderful analog with regards to some fields of space medicine, and 6 degrees head down tilt bed rest produce similar effects as weightlessness, at least in some body areas. Those include the musculoskeletal and cardiovascular system, but what you can also study beautifully is isolation, because people will be confined in the bed rest facility for usually 2 to 3 months, which is quite long, and so that is another thing you can really study. And then it's not suitable to study space radiation, just because simply the Earth's magnetic field shields all the space radiation off, and it's also not possible to study, of course, motion sickness, or at least space motion sickness, sickness in bed rest simply because there is no zero gravity. And then you can also not study the immune system because the characteristic changes of the immune system need proper zero gravity to occur, and among others. So there are other things, but this is just some examples. So during a bed rest period, participants are not allowed to get up at all. So they need to stay in bed all the time. There's no way of getting up or going to the toilet. So one shoulder needs to touch the bed at any time. And they're also not allowed to get visitors. So they will be in bed. They're allowed to roll over. They just need to touch the bed in a way. So they can lie on the belly. They can be on the side. They usually eat while lying on the side. And there are 3 typical study durations defined for comparability of results and of studies. Short-term bed rest is usually 5 days, but it's defined 5 to 14 days. Mid-term bed rest, 15 to 59 days. The common length is 21 days. And long-term bed rest is 60 days or more, and mostly 60 days are done. And here you can see a shower stretcher that is used in the German Aerospace Center, DLR, with 6 degrees head down tilt. And if you want to take a shower, or if participants want to take a shower, they need to roll over to the shower stretcher, and then they will be pushed into the shower, and they can take a shower privately there mainly as they like, but they're supposed to stay in the 6 degrees head down tilt position. And if you need to do a number 1 or number 2, the problem is solved in the same way as in the hospital. But this is why participants need to get paid a lot, because it's a lot of pain, you can imagine. There are certain interventions that are usually being tested during bed rest, and the interesting thing is countermeasures for spaceflight are usually also interesting or applicable to bedridden or immobile patients. And that's why I find this research so particularly interesting, amazing, because we can transfer the knowledge to clinical medicine. And examples of interventions are, for example, nutritional countermeasures such as whey protein, potassium bicarbonate supplements, or antioxidants. I will later show 2 examples of the NUC and MEP bed rest studies that had nutritional countermeasures. And then there are exercise countermeasures often tested depending on what is currently needed. For example, resistive or endurance training or vibration training. Examples of bed rest studies are the Berlin bed rest studies. And then there's short arm human centrifugation. That's currently the big deal and the big thing, because the idea is to put a short arm human centrifuge in a rocket. Rockets usually have a diameter of about 7 meters, and you can actually fit such a short arm centrifuge inside a rocket and deliver it up to space. And initially it was unknown which G levels are preferable as a countermeasure, and now currently testing is done on onboard exercise. So people are being spun in the centrifuge while cycling on the centrifuge, or while doing resistive training on the centrifuge or such. And then there are other things that can be tested, such as normal baric hypoxia or increased CO2 levels. A few years ago, we did a bed rest study in Slovenia in a facility that allows normal baric hypoxia, which was a really amazing experience. I had to do muscle biopsies in hypoxia, which was tougher than you think. And then now I'd like to briefly present 2 different study designs of bed rest studies that are most common. The first is when you have a long-term bed rest, 60 days or more, you usually do several campaigns with different participants. That means each participant only participates in one campaign, and in each campaign you have different participants because of the long duration of bed rest and the lasting effects of bed rest. So you will not have a complete washout of the effects before the next campaign starts, and that's why you can't reuse those participants, even though it would be desirable. Here is an example of a campaign schedule. So usually you have a fortnight of baseline data collection called BDC, where you do all the experiments once, and then during the 60 days head down till bed rest period, everyone has been assigned to their intervention or to control group, and these things take place during that period while there are less experiments. Some groups still have experiments, some don't, but most of the time people can just use their time as they like. For example, surf in the internet, play computer games, read books, or whatever it is, or write their thesis. We've seen lots of different things. And afterwards, once they get up, there will be another fortnight of recovery, and in that period usually the recovery is also a part of research. So there are usually rehabilitation schemes compared, which is also super amazing as a research field. And the second study design that I'd like to show you is the crossover design that is usually applied in short or midterm bed rest studies, because it's better to have the same person come back and to apply the control situation, but also the intervention to the same people. And here it's possible to do so. So you will have identical campaigns, 2 or 3 or whatever you need. In Slovenia, in the bed rest study, we had 3 campaigns, for example, and the same people come back. Usually there's about approximately 6 months washout period between those campaigns, and then people will come back and have either the control group first or an intervention first, and everybody is randomized in a different order to avoid seasonal effects. Because if you you have a campaign after a very sporty and active summer, you will have a different level of fitness compared to after a very long and dark winter maybe. And to make sure that these effects are mixed up, people are mixed up, and it's just that all of the interventions take place in each of the campaigns. And here's an example I created with 2 campaigns. I just thought we'd do a 21-day bed rest study with a 7 days BDC and 7 days recovery phase with 4 participants and 2 interventions. So it's the control group and the intervention group. And participant A is in the control group in the first campaign, and participant B is in the intervention group. And 6 months later, we'll run the same identical second campaign. And now, even though everything is similar to the first campaign, so it's like same shit, different day, the intervention is swapped over. So everyone who was in the control group in the first campaign is now in the intervention group, and so on and so forth. And that's how it works. I will later show 2 examples for bed rest studies of the 2 different types of bed rest studies where I've been involved. Briefly, a slide on the musculoskeletal system. There are actually tons of things happening in the musculoskeletal system, and it's a super interesting and amazing research field because there's so much to be explored, and it's especially relevant for sarcopenia research and for frailty research, and also a lot of things can be applicable to our patients in hospital. For example, polytraumatized patients also usually lie in bed and are immobilized for several months. So everything that applies here also applies to them. And so we have decreases in bone mineral density, in muscle strength and muscle volume, while there's a lot to be studied within the muscle. It's not just that it gets less, but it's actually a very complex thing to be studied. And then there's a fiber type shift in muscle. So endurance fibers turn into power muscle fibers. And when it's a shorter bed rest study, we see a lot of intermediate fiber types in the muscle tissue. And then kidney stones may form from the excreted calcium. When during bone loss, calcium gets into the bloodstream and is excreted through the kidney. Those kidney stones may form in the kidney, and that is very painful, but it can also lead to bad infections and really serious situations. And some space missions even had to be stopped, and some Russians had to fly back because of a urosepsis in the 1970s. And then there's space adaptation back pain. I find that one of the most fascinating fields in musculoskeletal research in spaceflight because it's something we don't really have on Earth. So the intervertebral discs expand because there's no pressure on them, and the body height increases by about 5 centimeters on average, sometimes even more. All the surrounding tissues are being stretched, and that's painful, and that's a deep pain and deep lumbar pain, and people have problems sleeping and working and often need to take painkillers. So the first research project I want to show to you is on back pain, and we did this in the NUC and MEB bed rest studies in 2010, 2012. Those were 2 crossover design midterm bed rest studies of 21 days in duration with 2 campaigns each. So we had 4 campaigns in total, and to study base adaptation back pain a bit further. Now, I will just give you a few more informations and then on the next slide show you what exactly we did. So the incidence of space adaptation back pain in astronauts is 52 to 74%, which is actually quite a lot. And often astronauts need to take painkillers, and sometimes even a bit more strong painkillers, especially during the first week in space. And it's a discogenic lumbar pain, usually without radiation. So the nerves that get out of the spine, they're usually not affected. So there's no problem with numbness or anything like that. But it's the pain in the lumbar area that is really the problem. And this fetal tuck position helps. So if astronauts pull their knees towards the chest, that gives them relief. So a lot of them sleep in their sleeping bags with the knees bent to their chest, or some even use a rubber band around their knees to get relief. And to study the changes in the IVDs, we conducted MRI experiments in the 2 bed rest studies of the European Space Agency. And what we did was we measured the T1 time with a specific protocol that's called the DGEMRIC protocol. It involves the injection of contrast agents and possible to indirectly determine the glycosaminoglycan content of the intervertebral discs. And in the other study, we measured the T2 time that reflects water and protein content of the intervertebral discs. And here you can see the same protocol that we looked at before, just in a vertical order. So we took measurements before and after bed rest in the one study, and in the other one, we also had 2 R+ measurements, one on the first day where they got up and one a few days later. And then we did semi-automated segmenting of the spine and of the intervertebral discs and did a computerized analysis of the image values. And results showed significantly lower T1 and T2 times after bed rest than before, and increases in water and GAGs after bed rest. That's a little bit surprising because usually GAG were thought not to increase, but this is just what we really found. And here you can see how just right after bed rest, this is before bed rest by baseline data collection, and this is after bed rest, the effect was much stronger than 5 days later. It was already almost half gone again. So that's how quick things change. And if you want to read up more about it, these are 2 papers we published about this project. I'm now going to talk about another project. So this was a project in 2 midterm bed rest studies with a crossover design. And the next project is on the Allegretto bed rest study that took place last year. It's a 60-day bed rest study conducted by NASA and ESA. And here you can see the team I worked in, consisting of people from the UK, Italy, from Switzerland, Germany, and the Netherlands. And together we had a set of experiments, and it was a 60-day bed rest study with 2 campaigns, one in spring and one in autumn last year, 24 participants, 8 women and 16 men. And the intervention was human centrifugation, so artificial gravity, with 1g at the center of mass. That's quite a good value and quite a common value, because if you take more g's, then there will be cardiovascular problems. And there were 3 groups: a control group with only in bed, continuous artificial gravity, 1 bout of 30 minutes artificial gravity per day, and intermittent artificial gravity, 6 times 5 minutes artificial gravity per day. And we had the neuromuscular interaction experiment package that included muscle biopsies. So I took muscle biopsies of the vastus lateralis and musculus soleus. We always take those 2 muscles because vastus lateralis is a power muscle and the soleus is an anti-gravity muscle that has a totally different muscle fiber type composition. And then we took blood and assessed serum levels of neurotrophic factors, biomarkers of muscle wasting and neuromuscular junction integrity. And we also applied an EMG method. It's called Munix or Musix. So we measured the number and the size of motor unit, and we did some other neurophysiologic measurements such as the H reflex, and we also measured the muscle strength. And here are some preliminary results. We haven't completed our analysis yet, especially because of the interruptions by COVID, but we found out that there was no change in motor unit number and size during bed rest, and also no effect of the artificial gravity countermeasure on that. And there were also no changes in any of the muscle markers we measured. So no changes in muscle wasting, neurotrophic factors, and neuromuscular breakdown. And the conclusion is that artificial gravity alone had no effects on the neuromuscular secretome or motor units. And in fact, it's necessary to conduct proper training on the centrifuge to be able to stop or to use centrifugation as a proper countermeasure. And that will be studied in the next bed rest studies next year in Toulouse and the year after in Slovenia. Thank you very much for your attention. That was it. This is the book my brother and I have written together and published this year in August. So it's a brand new book, The Spacefarer's Handbook. My brother is an astrophysicist working in Finland, and this is our author photo in the Soyuz capsule. And if you want to reach out to me or have more questions or are interested in working with me, please contact me through my website, www.bergitaganse.de. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ganse. That was great. We're going to move on to our final speaker of this session. It's a friend of mine, Vienna Tran. She's a medical student at the University of Adelaide, currently working on an honours project in bed rest and muscle health in collaboration with ESA and the UK Space Agency. She's an ISU Southern Hemisphere alumni and was class representative of that year, and has been also to the National Space Camp. When she's not wondering about the stars, she's interested in environmental advocacy and long-distance running, and her favourite space movie is Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. She'll be discussing the effects of centrifugation on gluteal muscles during 60-day bed rest, and after that, we'll have some questions. Take it away.
Thank you, James. And thank you, Bergita, for that wonderful presentation. It's an excellent introduction to the one that I'm going to show everyone. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Vienna Tran. I'm a medical student and also the co-host of this symposium along with Melanie. My talk is about the effects of centrifugation on the gluteal muscles during 60-day bed rest. So a bit about me. I'm a student at the University of Adelaide. I've been studying medicine for the past few years. And this year, I'm taking a year off the medical degree generally to study an honours and do a project in muscle health in space. This is a photo of me launching a rocket at International Space University earlier this year. In this presentation, I'll talk about the background of the study, the method that we use to obtain the results themselves, and the applications to wider medicine on Earth. Questions are welcome at any time, so please pop them in the chat when you'd like. And this will be very, very related to Bergita's. So she gave a general overview of bed rest studies, and this is one specific study. But first, I have a question for you. What do beds, butts, and the Blue Danube have in common? Stay tuned for the answer. So human spaceflight has spanned about 60 years, which is quite a long time. From Yuri Gagarin on the 12th of April, 1961, the first man in space, to the recent launch of humans in space on the commercial crew, Doug and Bob. So human spaceflight has actually changed a lot since then. then, and we know a lot more, but there is a lot more to know, especially if we are to send people back to the moon and further on to Mars. It's going to be a huge challenge. So the future looks promising, but we need to do a lot more space life sciences research in order to keep humans surviving and thriving on these journeys. One of the main problems with space life science research in general is the low sample size, and Dr. Russomano already emphasized this a little bit. There's not many people who have been to space, and in fact, only 12 people to the moon. So it's difficult and expensive to collect data this way. And that's why we use bed rest studies as one of the possible analogues. So this is the Agriza study. Bergita already hinted at this, but I want to talk about the scale and the magnitude of this project and what it really takes to study space medicine. Space scientists want to pay you almost $19,000. Sounds pretty sweet, right? To lie in bed, 2 months of bed rest. I don't know if I'd take that pay package, to be honest. So on the left is an example of someone lying in bed at 6 degrees head down tilt, and they would have had to do that for 60 days. So my research involved some people lying in bed as control and some people being spun in a centrifuge, as shown in this image on the right. And that centrifuge generated 1G at the center of mass of the person and approximately 2G at the feet. My next question to you is, what do you give someone who hasn't moved a muscle in 2 months? A trophy. The answer is a trophy, or muscle atrophy. What happens when you don't use your muscles in space is that they actually degrade and shrink and get weaker. These processes can be reflected in situations where people are older or are confined to the bed or are disabled or have chronic disease. What's happening on the micro level is that the rate of protein degradation of the muscle is greater than the rate of protein synthesis. So there's one thing you take away from this is if you don't use it, you lose it, whether you're in space or on Earth. Atrophy was one of the measures that we use to determine the effect of artificial gravity on the muscles. And the second measure is intramuscular lipid concentration. This is essentially the amount of fat accumulation in between the muscles and within the muscles. Here we can see 3 different study subjects. On the left, we have a younger male, 24 years old, and you can see that there's very little fat accumulation in between the muscles. Now we compare these 2 66-year-old males. While they're the same age and a similar body mass, the person in the middle has a greater fat mass because they probably do a little bit less exercise. Their average daily steps of 3,000 compared to 12,000. And so deconditioning can be measured by intramuscular lipid concentration, or ILC, which is an indicator of aging and of muscle weakening. The specific muscles that I studied are the gluteal muscles, or the bottom, and they are very important weight-bearing muscles which help us stand upright as well as walk and mobilize and stay stable. The 3 gluteal muscles that I studied were the gluteus maximus, medius, and minimus. The aims of my part of the study were firstly to do with the bed. How does bed rest affect muscle volume and fat accumulation? And secondly, how does artificial gravity affect those parameters? Does it slow down or mitigate the rate of gluteal muscle degradation? Here's the study design, which is a bit of a repeat of what Bergita has already talked about. The participants, 24 in total, had their pre-bed rest MRI to establish the baseline measurements, and then they were split into 3 groups: no centrifuge, 30 minutes of centrifuge continuously, and 6 bouts of 5 minutes of centrifugation. At the end of the 60 days, they were MRI'd again to see what had changed. And this is the way that the data was collected. The beauty of technology is that I was able to receive all these slides from Cologne in Germany. And my job as the young enthusiastic student was to trace the outline of each muscle of each participant. And in doing that, I had to identify, of course, which parts were muscle and which parts were irrelevant tissue. So this is just one example of a slide I had to do, but each muscle had about 30 slides in total, and there were 3 muscles on 2 sides and 2 sessions before and after, and there were 24 subjects. So in all, over 8,000 slices were segmented. After all of that, I can condense all those 8,000 slices into the next 2 slides. So here are the results of my study. I split it into 3 muscles: maximus, medius, and minimus. So let's have a look at what artificial gravity does to the muscles. We can see that during bed rest, there is a clear and statistically significant decrease in volume for all the groups. I call this the time effect. So regardless of whether you're in the control group, the continuous group, or the intermittent group, there was a decrease in muscle volume, which sounds pretty obvious at surface value. However, if you look at the amount of decrease, or perhaps the gradient between blue and orange, or before and after, you can see that there's no difference in these gradients, which means that the group that you were in didn't actually affect how much atrophy you had. And this is true for all the muscles. From this, we can conclude that artificial gravity does not mitigate gluteal muscle atrophy. What about fat accumulation? Well, we can see for gluteus maximus and medius that there was a statistically significant increase in fat accumulation. Again, pretty obvious and pretty expected given the slide that I showed you before with all the muscles. So we can see that there was an increase in all groups. However, the group that you were in, again, did not affect the amount of increase in fat. With gluteus minimus, though, there was not really much change, so we can't conclude anything for that. But overall, for maximus and medius, artificial gravity does not affect the rate of fat accumulation. So again, there's conclusions on one slide. Bed rest wise, yes, bed rest does affect the atrophy of the gluteal muscles and increases the fat accumulation of gluteus maximus and medius. However, when we come to the artificial gravity as a countermeasure, our protocols did not adequately mitigate the morphological adaptations of the gluteal muscles. It just wasn't enough. So we didn't see any statistically significant difference. As Dr. Russomano and Dr. Ganse have mentioned, there's a really great thing about space medicine, and that is that it can apply to Earth populations as well. And Agbreza is no different. With Agbreza, we can understand things for astronauts, such as how microgravity affects gluteal muscles in space. But we can also apply that to terrestrial patients, such as how bedridden patients and how bed rest may affect the gluteal muscles. From that, we can develop novel countermeasures for astronauts, how we can mitigate muscle deconditioning during long duration space flights, which is very, very important when we consider the fracture risk and the injury risk when they return to gravity fields. But also talking about new rehabilitation techniques for patients who are immobile and bedridden. For example, could we possibly use artificial gravity or a centrifuge as a passive rehabilitation technique for those who have undergone total hip surgery? So back to my question from the start, what do beds, butts, and the Blue Danube have in common? Well, I've talked about beds, I've talked about butts, and the Blue Danube. Well, this is a scene from my favorite movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and this is a space hotel that is spinning at 1G to help the inhabitants stay healthy in space. This movie was released in the 1960s before any of the Apollo missions really went underway, so it was quite prophetic. And during this particular scene, the song Blue Danube is playing in the background because the director chose to use that song to portray the gracefulness and the beauty of the spacecraft. So that's one of my favorite scenes. And if you've seen the movie, you might even hear Blue Danube playing in your head right now. So further directions from this study. The first thing to realize is that a negative finding is not the end of the story. And Bergita would agree with me because her study with the Munich's and the Music's measurements showed that artificial gravity did not show any significant mitigation of muscle degradation. So although artificial gravity didn't affect anything, this points us to see whether artificial gravity in terms of the regimens may be able to change. So could we expose our subjects to longer exposures of artificial gravity, such as an hour a day or 2 hours a day? And could we increase the dosage of artificial gravity? Could we put them under 2G or 1.5G? And how uncomfortable would that be? And finally, could we include exercise within the regimen? Because astronauts do exercise already. They do about 2.5 hours a day, just about. And we could combine that with artificial gravity to see if that could help. And finally, of course, the more people we help with this research, the better. And so we always recognize the reciprocal knowledge transfer for astronauts and terrestrial patients. I'm really excited to be working as part of this study. And eventually, it's my hope that the first astronaut to set foot on Mars will not only be able to stand, but will be able to do so proudly on a strong and healthy pair of glutes. Thank you so much to my supervisors, Gordon and Julie, as well as the other advisors in my team, Nick, Enrico, and Jim, as well as my mentors, Rowena herself, as well as Dr. Philpott and Dr. Gooden. That's all.
Thanks so much, Vienna. That was great. We've got about 8 minutes worth of question time to go. So I'm going to go straight to the chat because some of it's already been half answered, but it'd be nice if we could get it answered, like also for everyone else in the group. So we're going to go through. Question from Gordon Persk was, what was the time interval between the 5-minute bouts of centrifugation?
So there's always a short period of time it takes until it comes to a standstill. And then there was a 3 minutes break in the standing position. So it was approximately 5 minutes as well. So stopping the machine takes takes a while, and then 3 minutes of standing there. You could also do it in a different way and spread those 5-minute intervals over the day, but that's logistically not possible because you have to bring the person there and back.
Second question for Bergita or Vienna. With the conclusions of these studies in mind, for example, AG having little to no effect, which is artificial gravity, what do you think the major implications are for humanity in space and space medicine?
Would you like to answer, Vienna?
Well, that's $1 million question or $1 billion question. Well, this is just the start. This is really what I call a proof of concept study, because we're proving the concept that artificial gravity actually works. So far, for both Bergita's study and my study, it hasn't really worked. And so we need to tweak our protocol to see if it will work. Eventually, that's going to inform whether we'll be able to send our humans to Mars and beyond in a safe manner. And if it doesn't work, what else can we do to make sure this muscle mass and muscle size is maintained? Because it's absolutely mandatory that we keep astronauts healthy and able to stand when they get to Mars.
It was actually not really expected that artificial gravity will have a massive effect on muscle, because it's like putting a young person into bed and then letting the person stand up for half an hour every day without any further exercise. And we'd all intuitively know that that won't work. Human centrifugation is just amazing for the SANS problem in the eye and for some other fields. So we also decided to study muscle there. But for muscle alone, of course, it's not enough. We need more exercise, simply not enough.
Let's say that an astronaut is awake for 16 to 20 hours of the day, and 2.5 hours of that is actually dedicated to them exercising. And that includes setup of equipment, doing the exercise, performing hygiene measures, and then packing down the exercise equipment. So if we can maximize productivity hours by passively centrifuging them rather than making them exercise, then that would be a great thing. But so far, we haven't solved that problem yet.
And another question is, how fit do people really need to be healthy? It's not that they need to be 100% super athletes to perform a flight to Mars and also to work there properly. It's just more likely that a suboptimal solution will be chosen in the end, also because of payload issues.
Makes sense. Another question was, what were the group sizes? Are you powered for the null result?
888, and we're not powered for tiny differences, but we don't want to know about tiny differences. We just want to know about big things.
Makes sense. One of the other questions are, is there any thought on smoothing the artificial gradient, making it 1g across the entire body?
Doesn't work. It doesn't change it.
The problem with it, if you think about it in a physics sense, you would need to make that centrifuge infinitely big for it to have a 1g consistently across the entire body. Because the longer you make the arm of that centrifuge, the less that gradient would be, or the less steep that gradient would be. And so we have limitations size and logistics wise as to how we can spin the people.
I'm sorry, but that's not the point. So the whole thing comes from long arm centrifugation, and that's where experiments have been done on for many, many years. It just won't change the game. The question was, does the gradient have any detrimental effects? And it showed no, it doesn't. It doesn't change it. It doesn't help to have a longer arm.
And was that tested by looking at, for example, instead of using a centrifuge, if you just stood bed rest studies up, would that be essentially 1g over most of your body?
I don't know if anybody has ever tried that, run a bed rest study with just standing people up. I would love that. I think it's an amazing question.
Anthony Rengel's got other questions for Bergita. Hello, great talk. Currently on early stages of a project with Vienna looking at novel osteoporotic medication. What projects have been done looking at how pharmacological interventions alter results of bed rest studies plus or minus artificial gravity?
That's an amazing question. Thank you very much. Actually, a lot has been done on that, and it's already quite known what helps and what doesn't. So several people, including LeBlanc, and there was a big study by NASA. They tested a combination of calcium, vitamin D, and bisphosphonates. So bisphosphonates are medications that stop the osteoclast from degrading the bone by putting a substance inside the osteoclast and just disabling it. And those medications work really well, and problem doesn't have to be solved 100%. It just needs to be solved good enough. And NASA the community concludes that it's actually quite good already now with these medications.
One thing that I'd like to add to the medication, not in bed rest studies specifically, but in space, is that normally we just use the same dosage in the intervals of the medication that we apply here on Earth in space. But there are so many differences in our body in space in terms of metabolism or absorption of drugs, the excretion of drugs, that we need lots of studies in space, not in bed rest, considering space, of how medication should be prescribed, and just to apply whatever we do here in space, in my opinion, is a huge mistake.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
One more question before we go. The last one is, with the long lengths of time these people have in bed with no visitors and abandoned from everyone else, basically, how much is psychology an issue? Do you have people who quit halfway and just leave?
Hopefully nobody. So it's important to be able to finish the study successfully. So there's extensive psychological testing. And from more than 8,000 applicants, usually just 24 are selected. So it's just massive deselection of people.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, that brings us to a close. So after this session, first we're going to have a break for lunch for about half an hour. After this session, we're going to have an evening session chaired by Bergita on how to live on the moon and Mars, human rights and governance considerations.
Thanks, Vienna, for the amazing talk.
Thank you,
I think
Bergita.
Rowena will finish us off here.
Thanks, James.
Thank you very much to everyone who's contributed to this session. I think it's been wonderful to have a discussion of all these physiological issues that affect the human body during spaceflight, and really fascinating to hear about the studies which are being carried out and which also have translational potential to help people here on Earth. So thank you again. It's been really great to see you all, and we will take a half an hour break now and we'll be back before you know it. So we'll see you then. Thank you.